All right. Looks like everything seems to be working just about as good as it could. So let me get unparched real quick. And we'll begin. All right. This is Cancer Ward, chapter 8. The chapter is called What Men Live By. Books by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, narrated to you by Carter Banks. I also hashtagged this one the Carter Banks Hour because that was recommended to me by Nick and Vale on Instagram. Chapter 8. What Men Live By. If it hadn't been for the grip of cancer on his throat, Yefim Pavlovich would have been a man in the prime of his life. He was on the right side of 50, firm on his feet, strong-shouldered, and sound of mind. He was tough, not so much like a cart horse, but more like a two-humped camel. After an 8-hour shift, he could put in another, just like the first. In his mouth, on the comma, he used to lug 200-weight sacks about. And then his strength had hardly ebbed. Even now, he wouldn't quit when he had to help workmen roll a concrete mixer out on a platform. He had been all over the place and done a mountain of work, pulling down here, digging up there, here delivering and there building. He would think it cheap to take change for 10 rubles. He wouldn't reel on a bottle of vodka, but wouldn't reach for a third. Yefim Pavlovich knew no end, no bounds. He felt he would always be the way he was. In spite of his brawn, he'd never served at the front. Wartime rush construction jobs had kept him back, so he'd never known the taste of wounds in military hospitals. And he'd never had a day's illness in his life. Nothing serious, no flu, no epidemic touched him, and he never even had a toothache. He'd fallen ill for the first time the year before last, and bang. It was this. Cancer. Cancer! Now he could blurt it out, just like that. But for years he had been telling himself it was nothing, not worth a damn. While he could bear it, he put off going to the doctor. But once he had gone, they shoved him round from pillar to post until they sent him to the cancer clinic. But the patients there were always told they didn't have cancer, and Yefim wasn't going to figure out what he had. He couldn't trust the wits he was born with. He believed what he wanted to believe, that he didn't have cancer, that he'd be all right in the end. It was Yefim's tongue that had been hit, his quick, ever-ready tongue, which he had never really noticed, but which had been so handy in his life. In 50 years, he'd given it a lot of exercise. With it, he'd talked his way into pay he'd never earned, sworn blind he'd done things when he hadn't, stood bail for things he didn't believe in, howled at the bosses and yelled insults at the workers. With it, he piled filth on everything most dear and holy, reveling in his trills like a nightingale. He told fat-ass stories, but never touched politics. He sang Volga songs. He lied to hundreds of women scattered all over the place, that he wasn't married, that he had no children, that he'd be back in a week and they'd start building a house. God rot your tongue, one temporary mother-in-law had cursed him. But Yefim's tongue had never let him down, except when he was blind drunk. And suddenly it had started to bulge, to brush against his teeth. His juicy, soft pharynx had grown too small for it. But Yefim shook it off, grinning in front of his pals. Pavlovich, there's nothing can scare him. and they would say, "Ah yes, old Podiev. He's got willpower." But it was not willpower. It was sheer blind, cold terror. It was not from willpower, but from fear that he clung to his job as long as he could, putting off the operation. The whole of his life had prepared Podiev for living, not for dying. The change was beyond his strength. He did not know how to go about it. He kept pushing it away by staying on his feet, going to work every day as if nothing had happened, and listening to people praising his willpower. He'd refused an operation, so they started needle treatment. They pushed needles into his tongue as if he were a sinner in hell, and kept them there for several days. How Yefim wanted it to stop there, how he'd hoped. No, his tongue kept swelling. He could no longer muster that famous willpower of his. He laid his bull-like head down on the white clinic table and gave in. The operation was performed by Leonidovich, and he did it wonderfully, exactly as he had promised. The tongue was shortened and narrowed, but it was quickly getting used to the twisting about again and saying all the things it had before, although perhaps not quite so clearly. They punctured him again with the needles, let him go, recalled him, and Leonidovich said, "Now come back in 3 months and we'll do one more operation on your neck. It'll be quite an easy one." But Yefim had already seen quite enough easy operations on the neck, and he didn't turn up on time. They sent him summonses by post. He ignored them. He was used anyway to not living long in the same place. He was used anyway to not living long in the same place, and could fly off to Kolyma or Khakazia at a day's notice, easy as you like. Neither property, apartment, nor family held him anywhere. 2 things he liked: a free life and money in his pocket. They were writing from the clinic, "If you don't come yourself, the police will fetch you." That's the sort of power the cancer clinic had, even over the people who hadn't got any cancer whatsoever. All right, that's creeping me out, how it's like the lights are like popping on and off. I really don't want to lose any of this recording, so I did a quick pause, and I'm going to continue. I'm not sure what's causing that to happen, but do a quick pause and a save, and we'll continue. Not from the beginning. Command Z. We'll continue right here, and I'll patch it up later. He went, of course. He could still have refused to agree, but Leonidovich felt his neck and gave him a real piece of his mind for putting it off so long. And they cut Yefim up on the right and on the left of the neck, as hoodlums slash with their knives. He lay there, tightly bandaged for a long time, and when they discharged him, they were shaking their heads. He no longer had a taste for the free life. He'd gone off work and having a good time, off smoking and drinking. His neck was not softening. It was filling out, and it stung and shot pain right into his head. The disease was creeping up his neck almost to his ears. Then, not much more than a month ago, he had returned to the same old gray brick building, walking up between the poplars to the same porch, polished by so many thousands of pairs of feet. The surgeons immediately grabbed him like an old friend and put him into the same striped hospital pajamas in the same ward near the operating theater, with windows that gave onto the back fence. And there he waited for a second operation on his poor neck, which would make 3 in all. Then Yefim Pavlovich could no longer kid himself, and he didn't. He knew he had cancer. Now, trying to even things up, he began to push it home, to all his neighbors in the ward that they had cancer too, that no one would ever escape, that they would all come back in the end. It was not that he enjoyed crushing people and hearing them crunch. Only, why didn't they stop kidding themselves? Why didn't they face the truth? They did the third operation on him, a deeper and more painful one, but afterwards, when they were bandaging him up, the doctors didn't look any more cheerful. They babbled to each other, not in Russian either, and bandages got thicker and higher, knitting his head tightly to his torso. The shooting pains in his head got stronger and stronger, more and more frequent, almost non-stop. So why pretend? With cancer, he had to take what came to him. With cancer, he had to take what came after, too. He'd spent 2 years turning his back on it, shutting his eyes to it. It was time for Yefim to drop dead. When he said it like that, maliciously, it didn't sound so bad. It wasn't dying. It was dropping dead. It was easy enough to say, but his mind and his heart couldn't take it in. How could it happen to him, to Yefim? What would happen, and what should be done? Up to now, he had hidden behind work and among other people. But now it was right there, and he had to face it alone. It was strangling him, with his bandage round his neck. There was nothing his neighbors could tell him that would help, in the wards or the corridors, on the lower floor or upper. It had all been said many times, and it was all wrong. Then he started stomping up and down between the door and the window and back again, 5 hours a day, sometimes 6. He was running for help. All Yefim's life, wherever he'd been everywhere except the big cities. He'd combed all the provinces. He and everyone else had always known what was asked of a man. He had to have a good trade or a good grip on life. Both would get you money. When people met up, what do you do and how much do you earn? Comes straight after, what's your name? If the earnings aren't up to scratch, well, he's either a fool or he's unlucky, and on the whole, he's not much of a man. It was this sort of life, which he'd understood so well, that Podiev had seen in Vorkuta, on the Yen Sea in the Far East and in Central Asia. People earned big money, and then spent it on Saturdays or else blew the lot on holiday. This was all right. It suited them fine, until they got cancer, or something fatal like that. But when they did, none of it was worth a kopeck. Their trade, their grip on life, their job, their pay. They all had turned out so helpless, wanting to kid themselves to the end that they hadn't got cancer, and they showed up like a lot of poor saps who missed out on life. But what was it they missed? When he was young, Yefim had heard and knew it was right about himself and his friends that they, the young people, were growing up smarter than the old folk, who never even made it to town. They were scared, while Yefim rode horses and fired pistols at 13, and by the time he was 50, had pawed the whole country about like a woman. But now, as he paced up and down the ward, he remembered how the old folks used to die back at home on the Kama. Russians, Tartars, Voltyaks, or whatever they were. They didn't put themselves up or fight against it or brag that they weren't going to die. They took death calmly. They didn't stall, squaring things away. They prepared themselves quietly and in good time, deciding who should have the mare, who the foal, who the coat, and who the boots. And they departed easily, as if they were just moving into a new house. None of them would be scared by cancer. Anyway, none of them got it. But here, in the clinic, sucking an oxygen balloon, eyes hardly able to roll, the tongue keeps on arguing. I'm not going to die. I haven't got cancer. Just like the chickens, a knife was ready and waiting for them, but they all carried on cackling and scratching for food. One was taken away to have its head chopped off, but the rest just carried on scratching. So, day after day, Poldiev marched up and down the old floor, rattling the floorboards, without getting it any clearer in his mind how to meet death. He couldn't work it out, and there was no one to tell him. He would never have believed he'd find the answer in a book. A long time ago, he'd done 4 years in school, and he'd taken a construction course, but he'd never had an urge to read. He didn't read the paper. He listened to the radio, and he couldn't see the use of books in his everyday life. Anyway, in the wild, remote parts of the country where he'd knocked about all his life, because they paid a lot, bookworms were thin on the ground. Poldiev read only when he had to. Booklets on production experience, descriptions of the hoisting mechanisms, operating instructions, administrative orders, and the short history. There's an asterisk next to history. The asterisk says Stalin's History of the Soviet Communist Party, which used to be compulsory reading for every Soviet citizen as far as Chapter 4, the one on Marxist philosophy. Further chapters were for more advanced students, so short history just means 4 chapters of Stalin and Marxism. As far as Chapter 4, he thought spending money on books or dragging himself off to a library for them was simply ridiculous. If he was going on a long journey or waiting somewhere and a book came his way, he might read 20 or 30 pages, but he'd always drop it. He never found anything for a man in an intelligent turn of mind. Here in the hospital, there were books on the bedside tables and on the windowsills. He never touched them, and he would never have started reading this blue one with the gold signature if Kostoglotov had not palmed it off on him one empty, wretched evening. Yefim had put 2 pillows under his back and begun to flip through it. He wouldn't have started reading even then if it had been a novel, but it was a collection of very short stories. You could see what they were getting at in 5 or 6 pages, sometimes in just 1. Their titles were piled like gravel on the contents page. Yefim began to read the titles. He had the feelings right away that the book meant business, work, illness, and death. The chief law, the source. Neglect a fire, and it will overmaster thee. 3 old men. Go into the light while light is there. Yefim opened it at the shortest one. He read it. He felt like thinking. He thought. He felt like reading the little story again. He did. He felt like thinking again. He thought again. It was the same with the second story. Just then, they put out the lights. Yefim shoved the book under his mattress so it wouldn't be pinched, and he wouldn't have to go looking for it the next morning. In the darkness, he told Imagine the old fable about how Allah had shared out the years of his life and how man was given many unnecessary years. He didn't believe a word of it. Of course, he couldn't imagine any years being unnecessary, so long as he was healthy. Before he went to sleep, he thought again about what he had read, except that the shooting pains kept going through his head, getting in the way of his thoughts. Friday morning was dull, and, like every other morning in the hospital, heavy. Each morning in the ward began with a few of Yefim's gloomy speeches. If anyone spoke up with hope or a wish, Yefim poured cold water on it straight away and crushed the man. But this morning, he wouldn't even open his mouth. Instead, he settled down to read his calm, quiet book. There wasn't much point in washing, because even his jowls were bandaged. He could eat his breakfast in bed, and there would be no rounds for the surgical patients today. Yefim slowly turned the rough, thickish pages of the book, kept quiet, and did his bits of reading and thinking. The radiotherapy patients' rounds were over. That fellow in the gold-rimmed glasses had barked at the doctor, then got cold feet and had an injection. Kostoglotov pushed for his rights, kept leaving the room and coming back. Azovkin was discharged, said goodbye and left, doubled up and clutching his stomach. Other patients were called for x-rays and blood transfusions. And still, Podiev didn't creep out to stomp up and down the aisle between the beds. He just read to himself and kept silent. The book was talking to him. It was unlike any he had ever read. It really held him. He had lived his whole life without such a serious book ever coming his way. Still, it was unlikely he'd ever have started reading if he hadn't been in a hospital bed, with this neck shooting pain through his head. These little stories would hardly have got through to a healthy man. Yefim had already noticed the title yesterday, What Men Live By. The title was so put together that Yefim felt as though he had made it up himself, stomping about the hospital floors, thinking his nameless thoughts. He had been thinking that very question during the past few weeks. What do men live by? The story was not very short, but it read easily from the start, speaking softly and simply to the heart. A cobbler with his wife and children once lodged at a peasant's. He had neither house nor land of his own, and he supported himself and his family by his cobbling. Bread was dear, and work was cheap, and what he made by his work went in food. The cobbler and his wife had one fur coat between them, and that was falling into rags. All this was quite clear, and what followed was clear too. Semyon was gaunt. Mikhailo, the apprentice, was thin and haggard, but the squire was like a man from another world, with a great red snout and a neck like a bull's. His whole frame was as if of cast iron. He could not help getting hard and smooth with the life he led. Even death had no hold upon a clod like that. Yefim had seen a lot of people like that. Karashuk, the boss at the coal complex, he was one, and Antonov was another, and Cheshev, and Kukhtikov. And hadn't Yefim himself started pulling up on them? Slowly, almost syllable by syllable, Yefim read the whole story through to the end. It was then almost time for lunch. Yefim just did not feel like walking about or talking. It was as if something had been stuck into him and twisted inside. Where his eyes had once been, there were now no eyes, and where his mouth had been, there was no mouth. The hospital had already planed Yefim down roughly. It was easy to smooth him off now, sitting in the same position, supported by pillows, his knees pulled up to his body, the closed book on his knees. He stared at the blank white wall. Outside, the day was cheerless. In the bed opposite that, whey-faced holiday maker was sleeping off his jab. They'd piled blankets on top of him because of his fever. On the next bed, Amazin was playing checkers with Sibgatov. Their languages weren't much alike, and they were talking to each other in Russian. Sibgatov sat carefully so as not to have to bend or twist his bad back. He was still a young man, but his hair was very thin on top. As for Yefim, he hadn't lost a single tiny hair. He had great, wild, fox-colored thatch, so thick you couldn't pull a comb through it. He had almost his full force for women still. Not that that was any good to him now. No man could tell how many women Yefim had gone through. In the beginning he had kept account of them, with a separate one for his wives, but later on he hadn't bothered. His first wife was Amina, a white-faced Tartar girl from Yelabuga. She was a very sensitive girl. The skin on her face was so fine, you only had to touch it with your knuckles, and you'd draw blood. She was unruly, too. She left him, taking their little girl. After that, Yefim made up his mind he wasn't going to be disgraced like that again. He always left his women first. His life was footloose and free. He'd take a job in one place, then sign a contract for somewhere else, and if he had to drag a family along too, it would only get in the way. In every new place he found himself a woman to keep house. As for the others he met by the way, willing or unwilling, he didn't even always have to ask their names. They paid the agreed price. By now, faces, habits, and the way it happened were all mixed up in his memory, and he could only remember the unusual ones. That was why he remembered Yevdoshka, the engineer's wife, how she had stood under his carriage window on the platform at Alma-Ata 1, wiggling her bottom and asking for it. It was during the war, and the whole of his gang was going to Ely to open up a new construction site. There was a crowd from work seeing them off. Yevdoshka's husband, a shabby little man, was standing nearby arguing with someone over nothing. The engine gave a warning jolt. "Hey you!" Yefim shouted and held out his arms. "If you love me, jump in, let's go." She grabbed hold of his arms and scrambled through the carriage window, in full view of her husband and the whole crowd, and went and lived with him for a couple of weeks. This was what stuck in his memory. How he dragged Yevdoshka into the carriage. One thing about women Yefim had found out in his life: they cling. It was easy enough to get a woman, but difficult to see the back of her. Nowadays, the word equality was being bandied about a lot, and Yefim never said anything against it. Still, deep down, he never thought of women as fully fledged people, except for his first wife, Amina, that is. And he'd been amazed if some other fellow had seriously tried to tell him he treated women badly. But according to this curious book, it turned out that Yefim was the one to blame for everything. They put the lights on earlier than usual. The scrubbed little man with the lump under his jaw woke up. He poked his small, bald head out from under the blankets and quickly fitted on the glasses that made him look like a professor. He told everyone the good news right away. The injection had not been too bad. He thought it was going to be worse. Then he dived into his bedside table to get out his bits of chicken. Milksops like him, Yefim had noticed, always ask for chicken. Even lamb they call strong meat. Yefim would rather have watched somebody else. To do that, he'd have to turn his whole body round. But if he looked straight ahead, all he could see was this shithead wolfing a chicken bone. Pudiev let out a grunt and gingerly turned himself to the right. "Listen, here's a story," he announced in a loud voice. "It's called What Men Live By." He grinned. "Who can know a thing like that? What do men live by?" Sibgatov and Amazin raised their heads from their checkers. Amazin replied confidently and happily, because he was getting better, "Their rations, uniform, and supplies." Before joining the army, he had always lived in the AUL and spoken only Uzbek. All his Russian words and ideas his discipline, and familiarity with friends came from his days in the army. Anyone else? Yefim croaked. The book's riddle had taken him by surprise, and now the rest were finding it difficult too. Anyone else? What do men live by? Old Mursalimov did not understand Russian, otherwise perhaps he'd have given a better answer than any of them. But just then, the medical assistant, Turgan, who was still a student, came along to give him an injection. By their pay, that's what, he replied. The swarthy Proshka in the corner stared as if into a shop window. Even his mouth gaped, but he didn't say anything. Well, come on, Yefim demanded. Dyomka put down his book and frowned over the question. He had, in fact, brought Yefim's book into the ward, but he hadn't managed to read much of it. None of what it said seemed right. It was like talking to a deaf man who gives the wrong answers to your questions. It weakened him and confused everything, when what he needed was advice on what to do, and so he hadn't read What Men Live By and didn't know the answer that Yefim was waiting for. He was thinking up his own. Well, big boy? Yefim prodded him. Yes, in my opinion, Dyomka announced slowly, as if answering a teacher at the blackboard, trying not to make a mistake and still thinking it out between the words. In the first place, air, then water, then food. This was the answer Yefim would have given before, if anyone had asked him. The only thing he might have added was booze. But this was not at all what the book was getting at. He smacked his lips. Anyone else? Proshka decided to speak. Professional skill, he said. Again, this was something Yefim had thought all his life. Sibgatov sighed and said shyly, Your homeland? What's that? Asked Yefim in surprise. You know, the place where you were born in. Living in the place you were born. Ah. Oh no, you don't have to have that. I left the Kama when I was a young man, and now I don't give a damn whether it still exists. One river's the same as another, eh? In the place you were born, Sibgatov insisted quietly. You don't even get ill. Everything's much easier in the place you were born. All right, anybody else? What? What's this? Asked Rusonov, cheerful again. What's the problem? Yefim grunted and turned himself round to the left. The beds by the windows were empty, except for Wayface. He was eating a chicken leg, holding one end of the bone in each hand. There they sat facing each other, as if the devil had put them there for his own malicious pleasure. Yefim screwed up his eyes. It's this, Professor. What do people live by? Pavel Nikolaevich did not put himself out in the least. He barely looked up from the chicken. There's no difficulty about that, he said. Remember, people live by their ideological principles and by their interests of their society. And he bit off the sweetest piece of gristle in the joint. After that, all there was left on the bone was rough skin of the foot and dangling tendons. These he put on a piece of paper on top of his bedside table. Yefim did not answer. He was annoyed that this pipsqueak had managed to wriggle out of it so cleverly. When it came to ideology, it was better to keep your trap shut. He opened the book and stared at it again. He wanted to find the right answer for himself. What's the book about? What does it say? Asked Sibgatov, turning from his game of checkers. Here, listen. Podiev read the first few lines. A cobbler with his wife and children once lodged at a peasant's. He had neither house nor land of his own. But reading aloud was a long and difficult business, so he propped himself up with some pillows and began to tell Sibgatov the story in his own words, trying once again to grasp its meaning. Anyway, the shoemaker started hitting the bottle One night he was going home full of drink when he ran into a guy called Mikhailo, who was freezing to death and took him home. His wife scolded him. "What, another mouth to feed?" she said, but Mikhailo started working for all he was worth and learned to sew better than the shoemaker. One winter's day, the squire came to see them. He brought a piece of expensive leather and gave them an order, one pair of boots that wouldn't warp or rip, and if the shoemaker spoiled the leather, he'd have to replace it with his own skin. Mikhailo gave a strange smile because he'd seen something over there in the corner behind the squire's back. The squire had just gone out of the door when Mikhailo went and cut the leather and spoiled it. It wasn't big enough now for a pair of welted stretch boots, only for something like a pair of slippers. The shoemaker clapped his hand to his head. "You've ruined me," he said. "You've cut my throat. What have you done?" Mikhailo said, "A man lays down stores for a year, when he doesn't even know whether he'll be alive that evening." Sure enough, the squire kicked the bucket on the way home, and the squire's wife sent a boy to the shoemaker to say, "No need to make the boots, but we want a pair of slippers as quickly as you can for the corpse." "Good God, what nonsense!" Rusonov spat the words out with a hiss. "It's time someone changed the record. What a moral. It stinks to high heaven. It's quite alien to us. What does it say there that men live by?" Yefim stopped telling the story and moved his swollen eyes across to the bald pate opposite. He was furious that the bald man had almost guessed the answer. It said in the book that people live not by worrying only about their own problems, but by the love of others, and the pipsqueak had said it was by the interests of society. Somehow, they both tied up. What do they live by? He could not say it aloud somehow. It seemed almost indecent. It says here, by love. Love? No, that's nothing to do with our sort of morality. The gold-rimmed glasses mocked him. Listen, who wrote all that anyway? What? Mumbled Polyev. They were sidetracking him away from the point. Who wrote it? Who's the author? There, it's up there, look. At the top of the first page. What's the name got to do with the point? With their diseases? With their lives or deaths? Yefim was not used to reading the name at the top of books he read, and when he did, he promptly forgot it. Now he turned to the first page and read aloud, Tolstoy. That's impossible, Rusonov protested. Tolstoy? Remember, Tolstoy only wrote optimistic and patriotic works. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been printed. The Bread, Peter I, and let me tell you, he won the Stalin Prize 3 times. There's an asterisk for Rusonov. Rusonov thinks he meant Alexei Nikolaevich Tolstoy, 1883 to 1945. Tolstoy only wrote optimistic and patriotic works. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been printed. The Bread, Peter I, and let me tell you, he won the Stalin Prize 3 times. It's not that, Tolstoy, retorted Dyomka from the corner. Our books by Leo Tolstoy. Oh, not that, Tolstoy, Rusonov drawled, relaxing a little, but curling his lip a little too. It's the other one, is it? The mirror of the Russian Revolution. Rice croquets? Rice crockets? Rice crockets? There's 2 asterisks here. Rice crockets. Allusions to Lenin's opinion of Tolstoy and to his vegetarianism. Okay, so rice crockets. Your namby-pamby Tolstoy. There were plenty of things he didn't understand. You must resist evil, young man. You must fight against it. I quite disagree, answered Dyomka in a hollow voice. And that concludes Chapter 8 of Cancer Ward by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Yeah, that was a fun chapter. Narrated to you by Carter Banks. Tune in tomorrow for Chapter 9 we have got... I do promise you this. I will finish this book before I decide whether or not I'm going to keep doing this or do something else or what to do. And we've got quite a bit here, so... Yeah, tune in tomorrow at 9 p.m. for Chapter 9 of Cancer Ward. And thank you guys for joining me tonight. I'm going to see if I can try and start getting the edited versions up on YouTube. These should not be as hard to edit as Remembering Survival, because Remembering Survival is incredibly difficult to read. Anyway, hope y'all have a good night. Stay safe, and I'll see you tomorrow at 9 p.m. Central Time.